everyone. I'm Michele Pistone. I'm a professor at Villanova and also one of the co-managing editors of CMS's Journal on Migration and Human Security. And this last panel, we're going to talk about recent trends in asylum protection in the United States. When the panelists and I got together to start thinking about this, it turned out that a lot of the trends that we're seeing relate very directly to what's happening in the Northern Triangle. So we thought that we would frame this with reference to what we heard this morning from Juan Ricardo Ortega about Inter-American Development Bank's efforts at developing that that region, because whether it's directly or indirectly, a lot of the trends that we're seeing derive from that region. So what we're going to do is kind of walk you through the process, starting with Central America, with Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And Lisa Friedman from KIND, Kids in Need of Defense, which is one of the most amazing organizations working on this issue, is going to start off by talking about what's happening in the region in terms of push factors, and then the migration of kids and families from that region to the United States. And then Karen Grisey, who is, we heard from earlier today, she's public counsel here at Fried Frank and works on pro bono representation of people in all sorts of areas, including immigration, and works and trains lawyers here at the law firm to do pro bono work, which is a real testament, I think, to this firm and their commitment to pro bono service, to have Karen Grisey as a leader and for such a long period of time on these issues. So she's going to pick up with a discussion from the border and then talk about what happens and the trends that we're seeing, starting with detention and other things that are happening in the United States. At the end of Karen's remarks, we're going to go back to Lisa for a minute to talk about some of the changes in jurisprudence that she's seeing with respect to unaccompanied minors. And then we're going to finish with Kevin Appleby. Kevin Appleby has been working at USCCB, working on migration and refugee related issues for many years. Starting in January, he's going to transition over to CMS and will be the Director of International Migration Policy for both CMS and the Scalabrini International Migration Network. So he's going to finish by talking a little bit about some policy recommendations and what he's seeing happening in DC. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Michele, and thank you, Don, and thanks everybody for coming. And you see, you always learn a lot of new things. I just learned this about Kevin, for example. So as Michele said, I'm going to start talking, really, my piece is focused on unaccompanied children, and specifically starting from in-country and some of the push factors, and then making their way, some of what I'm going to talk about has been raised, but I'll sort of talk about it a little bit differently, or provide sort of different details, and we can talk a lot more, obviously, in questions and answers. And really what I'm looking at is following the surge of unaccompanied children to the United States in 2014, in fiscal year 2014, where are we now? What are the protection issues now? And the focus in terms of unaccompanied children on Central America, obviously, is that there are unaccompanied children and immigrant children not only from Central America, but the vast, vast, vast majority of the population of unaccompanied children to the United States that we're talking about are, of course, from Central America. So, as many folks I'm sure in this room know, that in fiscal year 2014, 68,000 unaccompanied children arrived at the United States border. About close to 58,000 of those children were placed in the custody of Office of Refugee Resettlement in the United States. In fiscal year 2015, which just closed pretty recently, about 39,000 unaccompanied children were apprehended at the U.S. border. And so I just want to say, as I talk about sort of push factors or root causes, a lot of times what we are hearing at KIND is, oh, well, the problem has taken care of itself, because look, the numbers are down so much. So I think first point I just want to make is that, first of all, 40,000 children coming on their own is actually still a really high number of children. But I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is the number that we're seeing, and why really there's not a lower number of children, in our opinion, leaving the region or in need of protection. There's a difference between those in need of protection and those making it to the United States. And that's part of what was talked about before. But so starting in the sending countries, looking in particular at Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, which have been the largest senders of unaccompanied children in the last couple of years to the United States, we are really continuing to see the same factors that were talked about with respect to fiscal year 2014. Incredibly high rates of violence at the hands of organized criminal gangs, very often at this point linked to some of the cartels, the drug cartels, sometimes not, sometimes also independent and smaller gangs without affiliation or without connection to the larger cartel situation. Violence in the home is a very significant factor in all three of the countries, whether that's child abuse, whether that's partner abuse that children are observing or witnessing or hearing, whether that's sexual violence, incest, which is really common in the three countries, and violence against women. So I mentioned intrafamilial violence, but domestic violence and femicide, so murders of women, gender-motivated murders of women, and really with impunity at incredibly high levels in all three countries. So we see this kind of incredible violence going on. UNICEF at some point in the last couple of years estimated that about 70% of children, I think this was in El Salvador, about 7 out of 10 children in El Salvador were experiencing violence in the home. That is extraordinary to think about. Now that doesn't mean directly, being abused, but experiencing violence in their home. It's just extraordinary numbers. So we hear those conditions and also have to keep in the back of the front of our minds, that there are really weak and pretty dysfunctional child welfare systems in all three of those countries. El Salvador is probably in a better, has a better child welfare system than we're seeing in Guatemala and Honduras, but majorly problematic. And this coming from, I used to work with kids in foster care in the United States. We have major problems in our foster care system, but we're not talking about anything that could even come close because of the lack of resources, the lack of oversight. So those factors very, very, very much remain, and in the cases we see of children in our legal services, work in kind in our 8 offices around the country, we're hearing these stories again and again about children fleeing those kinds of situations. At the same time, we're also talking about 3 countries that are clearly have major poverty issues, and when we look, and so some of the children, and many of the children, are in situations of extreme poverty. When we look at Guatemala, we're also in particular talking about children from the Western Highlands, which is a very highly indigenous population. And so we're talking about children who have grown up in situations of pretty significant social exclusion. Very few educational opportunities, very few opportunities to access the broader society outside of sometimes extremely isolated communities. So it's looking at all these factors together. So we see that happening, and there are obviously children coming north, and we're also seeing, and children and families, very high numbers of families in addition in 2014 and in 2015, and Karen will talk about that. But so folks are leaving, and where are they going? They're going north, heading towards the US and Mexico. They're also increasingly going south. We have really seen an increase in the number of Central Americans seeking refuge in Costa Rica, in Panama, in particular those 2 countries, but also more in Nicaragua, in Belize. So just a real, where can I get protection? Where can I go and get protection? And that is a very important factor and a newer factor that's come out of this phenomenon. In 2014, in UNHCR's report, Children on the Run, I think they found that there was an 1,100% increase in the number of asylum seekers in Mexico and Central America region. So the number of asylum requests, which is incredible to think about. So why are we seeing the lower numbers in the United States? This 39,000 children is very much related to something Tara touched on and came up I think David, Professor Martin may have mentioned it also, but these efforts to, you did, actually, this is really what you're talking about, efforts to intercept, right? So calculation to intercept. And sort of seeing that play out in several ways, and this is one of the policy decisions the United States made in response to the increase in unaccompanied children in 2014. So one was the U.S. in theory, the U.S. should address the root causes, but I'll say, and Kevin can maybe expand on this more, President Obama has requested $1 billion of aid to Central America in part to address root causes, to go into human development, to go into governance, and that has not made it out of Congress. And, so that I'll leave that there to come back to. But a second response has been on this interception piece, right? So another response to the increase in unaccompanied children. U.S. put a lot of money into Don't Migrate campaigns, so commercials, advertisements that went across the countries saying, don't send your children, don't go, it's dangerous, how could you put your children in harm's way? Another sort of step that the U.S. took was working with the sending countries to stop children and families. I've heard about it more with respect to children, but to stop them from physically leaving countries. So we heard in particular about Operation Rescue Angel, for example, in Honduras, where military units were given support and training to stop people from leaving. And we know from Casa Alianza, Covenant House, one of the Latin America branch of Covenant House, a partner that we work with a lot, that children, they had examples of Honduran children they met with who tried to leave a couple times and were physically prevented from leaving by Honduran military forces. And then we see in Mexico, and this is what Tara was talking about, this real effort, the southern border plan to stem the flow. And that has been a combination of U.S. and Mexico making, obviously decisions together, the U.S. providing major financial support and training and equipment related to, Plan Merida, et cetera. And the result has been that in 2014, Mexico deported 18,000 children, which is a huge increase from previous years. And Mexico is now apprehending a higher number of Central Americans than the United States for the first time ever. Mexico deployed, I think it was 300 to 600 of its, moved 300 to 600 of its federal immigration agents from different parts of the country all down to the south. And what they have done in real human terms is to go, I don't mean human, in terms of, real terms. And what they've done in real terms is to go out and to go to the trains, which folks have heard were, sort of the main source, the main route that a lot of migrants were taking was to go on top of freight trains. Go to trains and shoot. We have stories of shooting migrants on trains, of pushing migrants off trains. Actually, Sonia Nazario, who's on our board, was just wrote an article, editorial in the New York Times after a trip she had to southern Mexico, and I talked to her about it, and she was interviewing migrants who had these experiences. Immigration agents going to buses, removing people from buses, so a range of what we would expect to see to some really violent, and violent, concerning human rights violations. And the result has been, this real change in the numbers. And also, for those who make it to Mexico and who want to seek asylum, there's some serious barriers, for children, for families, and those barriers involve both, not knowing about the right to seek asylum. And if you don't ask for asylum, from what I understand from all the advocates we've worked with and from UNHCR, if you don't ask for asylum in Mexico, then you're not given access to it. So you have to know about the possibility. And then for many folks that I've talked to, if they do know about the possibility and they ask for it, they've been discouraged by immigration agents telling them, well, you're going to be in jail for 6 months to a year if you try to seek asylum. For those who do seek asylum, they're in detention. And there have been many accounts that have come out about the kinds of conditions in Mexican custody. We're going to hear about U.S. custody. It's worse in Mexico. And also there's a major shortage of the number of asylum agents to hear cases. So the Mexican Refugee Agency, Comar, has a total of something like 15 agents for the entire country. That doesn't make sense. And as a result of all these different pieces, interestingly, the number of applications filed overall, the asylum applications in 2014 was quite low in Mexico. It was only a little more than 2,000 applications filed. So they apprehended and deported about 100,000 Central Americans, but 2,000 asylum applications were filed. So that's, and out of those, about 20% were granted. So low grant rates, understaffed. So I'll stop there on that point. I just wanted to also mention, so a third sort of policy decision the U.S. made to respond to the surge in unaccompanied children was the Central American Minor In-Country Refugee Processing Program that Tara talked about and was mentioned in that earlier panel. I don't want to repeat anything, so we can talk about it in questions to the folks, to the extent folks are interested. But what we have certainly to date, not one child has yet arrived in the United States because of some of the challenges and some of the security, clearances. And that number that Tara gave, of the number of children approved for refugee status, the number of children approved for humanitarian parole, I also thought it's important to mention that out of the 4,600 applications, only about 100 interviews have happened, period. Right, so it's just an incredibly slow system. A second round of interviews hasn't even happened. And that program certainly can benefit children and can be one way. It's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to, take in the number of children that need protection, but there needs to be a lot of changes both to the requirements and the system to make it work. And then finally, before I turn it over to Karen, just to mention, and this is a little bit different, but this is not on Central American children, but at the U.S. border itself, for what continues to be a major issue is the screening of Mexican children. So we're talking about getting to the U.S. The screening of Mexican children, and Karen's going to talk about screening of families and expedited removal. The Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, which sets up the regime for screening of unaccompanied children, treats Mexican children differently, which treats children from contiguous countries, which for practical purposes, we're talking about Mexico, differently than children from all other countries, and results in very, very few Mexican children being brought into the U.S., screened into the U.S., where they could have an opportunity to seek legal status, to get to meet with a lawyer, to get a real assessment. And so instead what happens is the vast majority of Mexican children are given a superficial screening, which is supposed to identify children who are victims of trafficking, who are at risk of trafficking, or who are at risk of persecution, when in reality the Government Accountability Office recently issued a report finding that 98% of Mexican unaccompanied children were returned directly from the border. So I will turn over to Karen.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks everybody for hanging in there with us here at the end of the afternoon. I'm going to try to pick up at the point where Lisa stopped, where people, whether children or adults with families, have actually made their way to the United States and either presented themselves at the border or made an entry and been apprehended shortly after that. But I want to say that while most of my work is in the context of trying to recruit and train pro bono lawyers and get the children and the adults with children represented in the legal process, I'm aware that's not what I'm trying to do here, and really what I'm trying to show are some of the problems, challenges, deficiencies in our legal system as a way to illustrate the questions of whether the U.S. is meeting its own obligations toward asylum seekers and whether the system we have in its design or in its execution is what it should be. So that I want people to look at the migration questions and the U.S. obligation questions and not just, what's happening in the legal system. I want to say too at the outset, I do a lot of work with the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration and also with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and a lot of the information I'm going to share flows from that, but I'm speaking for myself, and I'm not a representative here today of either one of those two organizations, so any mistakes I make shouldn't be attributed to them. So starting at the border here, I sort of want to divide what I'm going to say into the unaccompanied children and the process that they face, and then the adults with children and the process that they face. And I'm focusing primarily starting on the period of summer 2014 when the numbers didn't start, but started to increase at a pace that got a lot of public attention. Something that's not new is that the problems, as I see them, two major deficiencies in the U.S. system are that there is mandatory detention. Children are not subject to expedited removal in the same way that adults are, but they are subject to mandatory detention unless they're paroled or otherwise let out of detention. So start with mandatory detention of arriving aliens, whether adults or children, and the fact that in the United States system there's no right to counsel at government expense, no appointed counsel. So anybody, asylum seeker, adult or child, is only going to have counsel if they can hire that lawyer or they are able to find a pro bono lawyer. So everything we're saying about the legal system, imagine a member of either of these two populations having to do that on their own. So we talked about the numbers. Basically, the best estimates that I have are slightly over 60,000. I've heard 62,000, 64,000 in the fiscal year ended a year ago. That number of unaccompanied children and roughly the same number coming in adult with children family units. This past year, most recently, a little bit down. So speaking of the unaccompanied children, the UACs, what was the government response to these large numbers? They started out putting them in very quickly put together, renovated, reconfigured military bases operated for the most part by FEMA. And I want to say I had the chance last summer to go and visit one of them at Lackland Air Force Base. The other two were in California and in Oklahoma. And the government, the leadership there, and I think very rightly so, was taking us around Lackland and touting what a wonderful job they had done of creating this facility to provide for these large numbers of children without the opportunity to plan, without much notice, very much, thrown up under adverse conditions. And what they showed us was there's a brand new soccer field, there are, the dormitory areas, there are colorful piñatas, there's a medical facility, there are teachers, and don't you know, at the end of every day at 3 o'clock, along come the child care workers pushing the cart with all different color snow cones, and the kids get to pick whatever snow cone they want. The deficiency to me is there are no legal services, right? Except for an organization called Raíces that was there on its own providing services, but I don't denigrate in any way the goodwill and the good intentions of the services that the government people are trying to provide. But at the end of the day, if the children don't have vindication of their ability to seek asylum, it's not only that they don't know how to make their cases, they don't know that they have a case. We interviewed kids who didn't know they were going to see a judge. They didn't know why they were there. So my only point there is how are snow cones and soccer fields, meeting our obligation to these children. Anyway, very shortly after that, the military base, approach was abandoned, and the children mostly started going to short-term shelter facilities on a contract basis, where, again, they were held a very short time. An attempt was made to reunify them with parents, other family members, or family friends in the United States, and almost all of them were reunified to other parts of the country in fairly short order, down to the point now where most of the time it's 3 to 4 weeks before the kids get to reunification. That's good in terms of getting kids out of custody, but it has attendant problems, which are there's not a lot of time to get any access to legal services or legal information, combined with a policy that the first court hearing for children is mandated by government policy to be within 21 days of the time that they're placed into removal proceedings. So imagine you have children moving around the country to different places with the need for change of addresses, needing to find lawyers, and a court hearing coming up within 3 weeks, and they don't speak English, and frequently neither do the people with whom they're being reunified. So the problem that's happened there is a large number of the kids are getting in absentia removal orders in their court proceedings, because whether for lack of notice, lack of an adult to transport them, lack of understanding of the process, or any of the variety of problems, they're often, too often, not making their way to court. And the best estimate that I have for the last 15 months is that the cases of the unaccompanied minors that have already been completed, and that's completed only, 43% of them have received in absentia orders. So that doesn't mean that they wouldn't prevail if they were in court having a hearing on the merits, but it's not happening right now. So the adult with children process is fairly similar. Most of the adults with children are coming in, and in the short term have been held in what have been designated, family residential centers, typically referred to as family detention or family detention centers. First in Artesia, New Mexico, which was a government-operated facility, and the two now biggest ones are in Karnes and Dilley, Texas, outside of San Antonio. Those are operated by private contractors to house the adult with family units. And then there is one, at least right now, still operating in Berks County, Pennsylvania, which is the only one that houses, in addition to women and children, male-headed families as well. So those 3 facilities exist, parents and children detained together, and no mistake about it, these are secure detention facilities, jails, where, they're not penal institutions, but they are jail-like secure facilities where parents and children are housed together. The big pitch at the very beginning when this started happening last summer was a message of detention. Secretary Johnson went out and said some language close to, make no mistake, if you come to the U.S. without permission, you will be returned, which seemed not to take into account the right of families to apply for asylum if they merited that form of protection, and detention was intended to be a deterrent. The government also argued in the bond applications of those women that deterrence was a factor, and they argued based on some old Haitian policy that the need to deter was an important factor in their need to keep women, adults I should say, in detention. That subsequently changed. The government has now disavowed deterrence as a factor in bond determinations, but I think it's fair to say that deterrence in the detention policy generally is still a factor in what's going on. So what happens in these facilities? The women are given in fairly short order a credible fear interview. I say women because I'm focused on the southern border, but it can also be men in those male-headed families. The adults get a credible fear interview, which is just to determine whether they have a reasonable probability of being able to establish a claim for asylum. If so, they're placed into full immigration court removal proceedings where they have a right to a claim before an immigration judge, but their first hearing has to be within 30 days. Like I said, for the kids, 21 days. For adults, it's 30 days for the women. And they have, after they've passed the credible fear, if they do, they have the right then to apply for bond, or in some cases, they're now being offered the alternative to detention of electronic monitoring. And I'm not going to go into the issues and the controversies surrounding electronic monitoring, but except to say that that's an additional layer of complication and technology that's causing some of the women problem in complying with their obligations even once they get out of detention. So they pass their credible fear interview. They may or may not get out of detention, and then they move on to eligibility for their asylum hearings before the immigration judge. The same problems that I mentioned with the kids of being able to relocate and prepare for an initial master calendar, try to get counsel within 30 days pertain for the adults. An additional complication is there's an obligation under U.S. law for adults, absent exceptional circumstances, to file that initial asylum application within 1 year of arrival in the U.S., and that has to be done in open court. So there has to be the perfect storm of getting a lawyer, knowing you have the right to apply for asylum, get an application completed, get it on file, and have access to a court hearing within 1 year. The reason that I'll mention that as a complication is that the court dockets are such that people are getting their initial masters timely, but continued hearings are out now very far, 2019, 2020 in some cases. So the ability to get an asylum application on file within 1 year or know how to qualify yourself for one of the exceptions is again another deterrent to people being able to make their claims. The in absentia number that I have for the adult with children cases, the best I can extrapolate from recent EOIR data is 48.5% of the cases that have already been completed for the adults have resulted in absentias. That's with no explanation as to why, doesn't reflect the merits, but there does seem to be both, especially on the children's side, but somewhat on the adult side, guidance from the government that the judges should show receptivity to motions to reopen where people can show problems with address change as a notice or inability to get a lawyer. So those may not all stay as removal orders, but I think the numbers are so much higher than normal in abstention numbers that it shows you that there's a problem with notice to this population. So my time is almost up. I'm just going to flag a couple of other issues that relate to this. The asylum officers are being moved from the asylum offices all over the country to the border area to do these credible fear interviews. The decisions are not always uniform. The standards don't seem to be similarly applied, and especially the training on the issue of particular social group and where these gang or domestic violence related claims may fit in are not completely uniform. There's also an issue under Flores litigation. I won't say a lot about the case except that it impacts whether children accompanied by adults are subject to the same protections as unaccompanied children. A judge has held that they are subject to those protections and they can't be held in secure facilities. So what happens in that Flores litigation going forward may impact the viability of family detention. And I should say that the government has taken the position now that these family detention centers are only intended to be short-term processing centers, and the goal is 20 days or less. We'll see whether 20 days is what actually happens, but I want to be clear that they are dramatically trying to shorten the time that the families are detained. Burkes may close because the licensing authorities in Pennsylvania have just recently stated that the facility was licensed for children only. It's as a child care facility, not to hold adults with children, and the facility has been told that its license will not be renewed in February, so ICE has to decide what to do about that, and I have no idea what that will be. That raises related issues of where families headed by dads will go if Burkes is closed, and how that decision may impact current attempts to license the facilities at Carnes and Dilley to take care of children. The one biggest thing I want to say is the impact that this issue has had on the whole rest of the asylum system. The question that was raised earlier about Sierra Leone and what about Africa, let's say what about the whole rest of the world when all these resources are properly devoted to dealing with this surge in the Central American cases. The asylum offices are now 2 years out on an interview for new cases filed today because the unaccompanied children cases are prioritized. And the immigration courts, as I said, are so far out that most of the cases that are not the unaccompanied minor or the adults with children dockets have been temporarily, not formally suspended, but they've had dates pushed out to 2019 or 20, sort of holding dates while the courts cope with these dockets of cases that they've been told to prioritize. So that means everybody else that's waiting for a decision, that needs a work permit, that needs to be reunified with family members abroad, that's not happening because of the cascading dominoes of dealing with family detention issues. So the impact of that is super hard to get pro bono lawyers into the picture because they feel obligated and committed to the cases they already have no idea when those are going to be heard. They're hesitant to take on new ones because of their obligation to the existing ones, and even the new ones, law firm turnover being what it is and the mobility of this population, it's super hard for people to know whether they can conscientiously take a commitment to a new case and honor it and follow it through. So I'm going to stop. I want to leave the recommendations mostly to Kevin. The biggest one that I'll say is resources, resources, resources. This is one that ABA and AILA has been making for a long time, but the immigration courts, the BIA, the asylum offices, ORR, everybody involved in this process needs the money to do their job right, to eliminate the backlogs, and that's sort of the foundational thing before we can even address what the proper policy points should be, and I'll stop there.
I'm going to quickly touch on a couple of points related to protection for children once they're in the U.S. and then turn it over to Kevin on policy. And I'm not going to talk about jurisprudence so much. I'll make one point about it, but just to really, I'm going to talk a very little bit about children's asylum claims and special immigrant juvenile status. The sort of two major forms of immigration protection or immigration relief that children, in particular unaccompanied children, but that children seek in the U.S. So on asylum, there have been some real advancements since the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, particularly that children's cases, unaccompanied children's cases, are now heard in the first instance at the Asylum Office, part of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, instead of in the first instance in the immigration courts for children who are in removal proceedings. Not to confuse, if a child, like if an adult or child is not in removal proceedings and is in the United States, they typically can file affirmatively for asylum and go forward that way. But until the TVPRA, unaccompanied children who were apprehended and placed in removal proceedings had their initial hearings in the immigration court. So that's changed with TVPRA, and that's been a huge advancement, but I do want to say that initially following TVPRA, there were some major challenges to this, I'm going to call it initial jurisdiction provision, because it was a question of who has jurisdiction initially over children's cases, unaccompanied children's cases. And then that improved a lot, but recently, in recent months, we have seen some regression on that issue, where it's starting to be in some immigration courts, immigration judges deciding that they are going to determine whether a child is unaccompanied or not based on the statutory definition of an unaccompanied child, and they're not going to defer to USCIS policy. So that's definitely a protection concern that we have. In addition, I think it's important to, without going into the details about it, I think there really is a problem that we have in terms of disparity sort of in adjudications, both at the immigration court level, and there's been a number of studies about this, Phil Schrag and Mandy Schoenholtz's study, and Jaya Ramsey, Ramsey study on that issue. Also, we have the same issue at the Asylum Office, and the recent numbers that you can look at show that some of the asylum offices, and I'm going to particularly highlight Houston because it's a real problem, the grant rates for unaccompanied children's asylum cases in the Houston Asylum Office are so much lower than in the rest of the country. And we've also heard, frankly, from our office in Houston that they run into very similar sort of especially challenging problems in the immigration court in Houston. And so, so I'm flagging it. I'm just going to flag it because we can talk about it more. But that's definitely a concern that we have and something that we're looking into. In addition, for children who are either don't make it to the asylum office because a judge is saying, I have initial jurisdiction, I'm going to keep the case here, or who get referred back to the immigration courts, certainly there are some really, really sensitive judges, and we have guidance on how unaccompanied children should be treated in courts, but we do continue to have some real problems in depending on the judge in children's cases. And regardless of, some judges may really have an understanding of sort of special, accommodations to make for children, but they may still actually have a very narrow interpretation of the refugee definition when it comes to children's cases. And that is a problem that we definitely see and is a major concern. And I think the last one on asylum I would just mention is that while we've seen some really positive, we actually have seen some positive both federal level and then a number of immigration court decisions, and I just saw actually really an unpublished, really good BIA decision on this, but granting asylum in the context of violence by criminal gangs, by organized criminal gangs, there is some real resistance to recognizing those claims as viable by some decision makers, and obviously many children's cases have in large part or in some part that is a basis, Central American children's claims. And on special immigrant juvenile status, just to mention that the TVPRA also made some changes with respect to special immigrant juvenile status, which had resulted in greater protection, greater grant rates of more children seeking and being granted special immigrant juvenile status. And recently, we also have some concerns around the tightening by sort of the handling of those cases by USCIS, in particular, to say that there's a lot more sort of scrutiny by USCIS of state court orders and state court decisions, which really are the proper, decision of the state courts and the expertise of the state courts, and that's how the statute was designed. But we're seeing a lot more scrutiny, and that is very concerning. And also that there's an effort on regulations and policies being pushed forward, but there's not a lot of transparency as to what is included, what that process is, etc. So I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for having me today. I'm going to regale you with Washington political stories so that you are at least entertained a bit before we end today. But before I do, I'd really like to say how happy, excited I am to join the Center for Migration Studies and the Scalabrini and Immigration Network in January. I'm looking forward to working with Don and Rachel and Daniela and Reese, and I'm sorry if I missed someone. Also with Bishop DiMarzio. I'll continue to work with Bishop DiMarzio and Father Lidio and Archbishop Silvano Tomasi, and I really look forward to it. I am a bit sad that I'm leaving the Bishops' Conference. I've been there for 17 years. It's a long time, but my current boss, Bill Canny, is here, and I hope I can continue to serve the church in my new role. We're all Big One Church, and we're all on the same side, so I hope we can collaborate. And I look toward this position as a great opportunity to educate policymakers on migration and to use the great scholarship of CMS and try to translate it into good policy and good laws, both in Congress and at the UN. We've learned that our policymakers, and including our presidential candidates, need a lot of education on migration. I'm going to start you off with a quote from the Pope, who recently visited New York. Very powerful visit. It's funny, this Holy Father is good with words, but he's also good with actions. And one thing that moved me was I was reading an article, and Bishop DiMarzio hopefully can confirm this. He was flying from JFK to St. Pat's, and he asked the pilot to fly over the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island. And it wasn't widely reported. It was one of the articles, and it just hit me across the face like how powerful that is. But in his speech to Congress, he really gave us a lot of great material. I like to joke that I think that I'm getting too far left on the issue, and then the Holy Father gives me great cover. But this is what he said, and it's important because it's an important lens through which we should look at some of these issues. He said, in a word, if we want security, let us give security. If we want life, let us give life. If we want opportunity, let us give opportunity. The yardstick we use for others is the yardstick time we use for us. And it's the golden rule. And it's not just about doing good. It's also saying this is in our best interest as a nation. It's not just like turning the other cheek, but it's also our best policy. Because if we don't protect people, then how do we expect the rest of the world to do it? And how are we going to live as a global community? And I think that's really was a powerful message that the Pope delivered when he was here. And hopefully Congress will listen, although the signs right now aren't great. The big news this week, and was confirmed today, is that Paul Ryan is the new Speaker of the House. And there's good news and bad news there. The good news is that he was one of Speaker Boehner's sort of lieutenants in trying to round up votes for legislation last year to pass comprehensive immigration reform. He and Representative Merrill Diaz-Balart of Florida were the ones that were working on getting Republican votes for a package to pass right when Eric Cantor lost. He also was quoted by Luis Gutierrez, and he was quoted in the paper that he didn't want a permanent underclass in our country. And he got that from his Catholic faith. So here's a guy who understands the issue, who I think supports the issue, and I think in the long run will be committed to the issue. The bad news, however, you might have heard, is that he's made a promise, a twofold promise to the Republican caucus, that first of all, that he'll won't bring up immigration reform under President Obama. Now that's not a big surprise. I don't think it would have passed before the election in any case. The second thing he did was more troubling, was that he said that as long as he's Speaker, he's going to still employ the Hastert rule to immigration bills, which is very troubling because that can last for a while, and what it does is it means the Senate bill, even though that's a flawed bill, isn't going to pass. It means that a pact of citizenship in the House, this is in the House, is not going to pass if he goes by that majority rule. So, first of all, immigration reform is not going to pass before the election. But the second thought is, I don't know if we want it to pass before the election, because what we would get in the House is something, at least the bishops, I think, would be unable to support moving forward. The possible silver lining here, though, is I think that he will stop bad things from happening. I think that he will prevent laws that have been, or bills that have been passed by the Judiciary Committee, for example, from getting to the floor, because he understands, open a Pandora's box, number one, but number two, what it looks like nationally for the Republican Party. And again, let me just say a disclaimer, I'm a flaming moderate, so don't take anything as a partisan comment here. So there's good and bad with this leadership change. And certainly, if we had gotten someone from the Freedom Caucus, it would have been a lot more dire. But I think we're going to hold the line for a while, and hopefully we can work and press upon the Speaker that he's got to jettison this Hastert rule for us to get a good bill moving forward. So from now until the end of next year, we're probably going to be playing defense. And I mentioned some of the bills that are bad. One of the bills that's really bad is one that was passed out of the Judiciary Committee called the Asylum Reform and Border Protection Act, which is sitting there to be considered on the floor, and what it does is changes the definition or the standard for meeting asylum to more probably than not someone is telling the truth as opposed to just credible fear, which would really knock a lot of people out. It also, of course, would have repealed the protections in the TVPRA for kids. Hopefully that will die. We just dodged a bullet with the sanctuary legislation. Stop Sanctuary Policies and Protect Americans Act, which was the bill that was introduced when Catherine Steinle was killed in San Francisco, and that, of course, would have imposed a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years anyone who illegally re-entered the country. And it didn't have any exception for asylum seekers who often are deported upon first entrance into the country and come back again. They would have been imprisoned for 5 years. But we were able to stop that because they didn't get enough votes for a filibuster. And so that was a victory, but there's a chance that some could try to attach it to an appropriations bill moving forward. There are some opportunities for improvements. It's not all dire. But particularly in the budget. The good news again this week was that there was a budget deal that hopefully will pass today or tomorrow, and then the appropriations committees will start passing bills or creating bills to create an omnibus, which needs to be passed by December 11th. And there are some nuggets in those bills that we can work for to improve the situation in Central America and with kids and families. One is, of course, the $1 billion the Obama administration asked for, which has been cut, and ensuring that a lot of that money either is restored or goes to really economic development or youth development programs and not just to enforcement. There's also $60 million in the Justice Department budget for immigration judges, which is still there. It's at risk, but I think we can hold on to that, and that would help improve the waiting line that was discussed. And the administration also proposed $55 million for immigration attorneys for kids. Sadly, that's been zeroed out by the House. There's a chance to restore part of it in the Senate, but we're going to have to work hard to get that. And as we know, representation is so key for children and for families, as we saw the absentia rate. 88% of kids who haven't reported had no attorneys so far, and kids are certainly 5 times more likely to get relief if they have an attorney. So that's a very important piece moving forward. I think we have more of a real opportunity on the administrative side. And I say that because I think, and base this on some conversations, that the administration, as they get closer to the end of their term, will be concerned more about their legacy, especially on immigration. We've got a DACA program that's in peril that likely won't hit the Supreme Court at this point until after Obama's gone. So he'll be left with a legacy of a DACA program, which is important, but he also will be left with a legacy of family detention and one of the largest deporters as president. So I think more pressure on the family detention, for example, would help tumble that eventually, and I think the chances are greater as we get closer to them leaving. I think the Burke's development is helpful, the decision from California is helpful, and I think the advocates are doing a good job of pounding on them on this. So I think there's hope that they'll abandon that strategy and hopefully create alternatives to detention, which are run by NGOs who have child welfare and family social service experience. There is a small pilot that's just been awarded to a for-profit company, which is very controversial, and we're trying to figure out how to go whether to cooperate with that or to abandon that. But I think we can put more pressure on the administration to expand those programs going forward. I also think, as Lisa mentioned, that we can put pressure on the administration to screen Mexican children more effectively, and we've been pounding this issue for a while. USCCB did some trainings for Border Patrol officers last year to train them on how to identify signs of human trafficking with children, and that was very well received. And we've also been trying to work with them to let child welfare professionals into the Border Patrol stations to talk to the kids, because kids, are traumatized, and of course they're talking to law enforcement personnel, so they're not likely to tell their stories. I think there could be progress made on that. The Central American Minors Program, which was mentioned, let me just make one comment about that. It's sort of the only game in town right now, and we can't abandon it. And there's many in government that just want to jettison it, and as you can tell from the numbers. And there's a lot of reforms that can be done to improve it, and I won't go through them all, but certainly the eligibility criteria, where it's only parents who are legal status in the U.S. can petition for the kids. At least they can expand that to a wider number of family members to increase the numbers. And of course, security in the region needs to be improved so kids can come forward. I think we can make progress on that. Bishop Seitz of El Paso testified before the Governmental Affairs Committee last week, and he recommended that a regional asylum system be set up in Central America and Mexico, so that kids have protection as well as enforcement. His line was, if we're going to export enforcement, we have to enforce protection. And I don't mean using the Mexican laws, which are good but aren't implemented well. I mean using UNHCR to come in and set up a system, just as they would in another country if there was a refugee situation, and to use best interest determinations for the children so that they can be resettled in different countries in the region. This is something that we think could be piggybacked on the CAM program and increase protection for children. And then finally, this is an obscure issue but an important one. We think we can get Health and Human Services to better fund what's called post-release services for children. Children are released to family members, sometimes to friends of the friend of a family, and there's really no follow-up. Only in 10% of the cases are NGOs such as USCCB, LRS, able to go in and study the home and see who the family members are and make sure that the kids are enrolled in school, but most importantly, make sure that kids can get lawyers so that they show up at their hearings. And this is severely underfunded, but it's been effective in ensuring that kids do show up and that kids are safe. There have been some incidences of kids that have been released, especially during the surge, who have fallen into traffickers' hands because there wasn't any follow-up. So this is something that I think that we can make a difference on. So in summary, there's opportunity and there's warning here. I don't think it's in our best interest to have immigration legislation on the floor of the Senate or the House before the election, obviously. because I think the outcome would be bad if that were the case. I think what we need to do is defend against bad bills coming to the floor and opening a Pandora's box, because I don't think we would have the votes to defeat them. I guess we'd have to rely on the president to veto them, but you can't always rely on that. So, but there are budget opportunities I think that we can take advantage of, and there are administrative advocacy opportunities I think we can take advantage of. And I think the message to the Obama administration is, look, you don't want to leave a bad legacy in this area, and you don't want to be left with a legacy of family detention. So I think that's something we should continue to push. So I'm going to finish with one more Pope quote for you, if I can find it. Again to Congress, and I call this his immigration reform position, and also in the same time his rebuke of certain officials, candidates, and their negative rhetoric at the moment. And I quote, "We must resolve now to live as nobly and justly as possible as we educate new generations not to turn their back on their neighbors and everything around us. Building a nation," he said, "calls us to recognize that we must constantly relate to others, rejecting a mindset of hostility in order to adopt one of reciprocal subsidiarity and a constant effort to do our best." And he concludes, "I am confident we can do this." Amen.
So I think we have a few minutes for questions. And Reese, do you have the mic? Looks like there's a question.
Yeah, thank you. Lisa, well, you were saying about the situation in Central America, the deportations and the shootings of Mexico and the whole situation. Being ignorant about it, what is the U.S. position on these violations on human rights? Mexico, doing his job. I mean, what is the position on the U.S. about it? Because I have two questions.
Yeah,
So one of them is
you
this.
want to answer that. I think all I would say is that the U.S. has, sorry, that's a beautiful voice, has, certainly the U.S. would not support publicly, the U.S. would not be in support of violations of human rights. However, the U.S. is definitely providing the funding, the training, the support and or pressure, depending how you look at it, for Mexico to have really stepped up its enforcement. And at the same time, what the U.S. should be saying is you can enforce immigration law, but you also need to screen, really, truly, meaningfully screen for international protection needs.
Right.
And that's what the U.S. is not doing. And I mean, that is the U.S.'s message, but not doing really enough to, in our view, I think, to really push that message.
Right, thank you.
And I would say, I disagree that it's all in the U.S. I think the Mexican government has a responsibility here as well. And the argument, I think, is, why are you doing the U.S. dirty work for them? And why are you not protecting these kids? I don't know what the reason for that is, but I mean, I think there is a sort of element there, and I don't know Mexican political culture that well, that,
Yeah, because what's happening is horrible. The job.
Well, the prospect of the U.S. telling the Mexican government this is how you should enforce your laws, it seems, would be rejected by some in Mexico. So I think it needs to be a joint U.S.-Mexico advocacy to both governments that this is unacceptable.
Absolutely.
Interestingly, just to say, Mexico on the books, Mexico actually has a law requiring best interest determinations be made in the case of every migrant child that reaches Mexico before they can be repatriated to their country. That's not happening at all in practice,
Right.
but actually that's on the book, so I thought it's worth mentioning. We don't have a similar law in the
Right,
US.
thank you. Now I have another question. To apply for asylum, you say asylum? It's
Asylum.
Asylum, I'm sorry. Yes, to apply for asylum, a person needs to prove identity and nationality. However, what happens if a person or a child was not registered at birth and he doesn't have any documentation? Where, as a question, where do they send them, or what happens to them, or is it like a registry of these people who, you know, you can't provide asylum because they can prove their existence?
I don't know how that's working in Mexico. I don't know the ins and outs of the Mexican asylum system, but in the U.S. asylum system, you know, if a child is credible and you know, provides testimony, if the child has no, you know, there's no birth certificate that the child can speak of or can find, obviously an attorney would do what they could to try to get a baptismal record, something they could try to get. If there truly is nothing, the child's credible testimony and, you know, the caretaker, the person who raised the child's credible testimony can be sufficient.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you. That answers.
All right, it looks like there are a few other questions in the front row here.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment to what you said, Kevin. I'm from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and I moved to the U.S. basically fleeing a 10-year drug war that is ending right now. And I definitely think that Mexico should take responsibility and not do the dirty work of the U.S., but I think it's also really important to remember that a lot of people in Latin America are leaving due to U.S.-induced wars and problems. So yes, Mexico should take responsibility, but maybe the U.S. should stop sending us guns to kill each other. So
I don't disagree with that.
So there's a comment, I mean a question on this side, and then we'll get to you in the back.
Thank you so much. Just kind of two points. One is earlier in the day it was mentioned that, you know, the Act of 1980 really focused on adults or adults with children, you know, coming as refugees or being granted asylum, and that the expectation was that they become self-sufficient, and all of the programs for refugee resettlement and for refugee benefits are geared towards helping people with employment. However, with UACs coming in the past year and a half, we've been seeing more and more children granted asylum, and they're on their own cases. Therefore, all ORR funded programs for social services at the state level and at the local level, they're basically not eligible for case management services, for any of the programs that we run in refugee resettlement offices. So it's, you know, we can kind of cobble together some private dollars and try to help where we can, but we're already stretched so thin, and doing many other things pro bono, including all of the CAM applications. So it's just an important advocacy point there. Of course, they're eligible for welfare, they're eligible for SNAP, but their parents are undocumented. They're afraid to bring them to register for those benefits, and they start to get into a web of different kinds of applications that induces a lot of fear on the parts of their sponsors or their parents or their aunts or whoever they're with. And it's something that seems very easily addressed at the ORR kind of administrative level. I don't know if you'd like to address that. Just my second point is that, again, as I mentioned, the CAM applications, there are many of them. Refugee resettlement agencies are not getting $1 to do this work. Carmen, my colleague in Long Island, has done hundreds and hundreds of applications. It's not something that takes 5 minutes. These are people who have very low rates of literacy. You have to follow up. You have to help them with the DNA process, help them sending out letters. We don't even have money for printing papers. So there's got to be something at that, for that advocacy point as well. Thank you.
Just quickly, I would love to comment on, one is to say, completely agree with your first point about the benefits, and also related to that, interestingly on CAM, kids who come over with refugee status will be getting refugee benefits, but children granted humanitarian parole will not have access to any benefits. And that will be the in this first round at least, that's the vast majority of kids coming. So that's very concerning.
Yeah. No, yeah. I just was going to follow up that administratively, refugee resettlement agencies get $900 per refugee arrival for our staff, for our rent, for everything that we're supposed to actually pay for. So, you know, yes, eventually, if we sow those seeds, we're doing it out of a sense of mission.
Right.
We're not doing it because we're raking in the dollars. But minor cases in particular require even more than regular refugee cases. We do a pre-arrival visit and 2 further home visits. And my agency is taking cases as far away as Kingston. Which
Right,
is,
and for the children granted humanitarian parole, your agency is not going to get
Not a
any
dollar.
dollars.
Right.
It's definitely a point we've been raising. It's a real concern, and also, we've been concerned that with this first grant rate, our resettlement agency is going to be hesitant to now take the time to file because they're already backlogged and not getting funded for it. So.
Just as a follow-up to that, one of the issues that we are also looking at the first round of interviews that came in, I think it was June, we got the results in August, where 12% were approved for refugee status or recommended for refugee status and 84 for parolee status. Children in the United States at least get the benefit of an attorney. Children in the United States at least get the benefit of an NGO advising them what is refugee, what is the whole process. These children are not getting that. We have gone as far as I am training the parents and telling them what is refugee. So try to imagine giving a class about refugee status to parents here who have very low literacy rates in the hopes that they will be able to tell this to their kids and increase that level of approval. Because that's what is happening. The children are going by themselves or with somebody who doesn't understand what is going on. And also, the government and like Kevin said, it's the only game in town, and I don't want it to end. I want these children to get this, but there's better ways to improve it.
Yeah, it completely agree, and I would just say that that's something that some advocates have been starting to raise. In the overseas refugee processing system, with the exception of a statute for a specific subgroup of Iraqi refugees, there's no counsel. So Department of Homeland Security does not allow counsel attorneys to accompany children to participate in the refugee interviews. And it's something that we have raised, real concern about, and the ABA, the American Bar Association, actually just submitted a letter to the government expressing their concerns about it. And as far as we can really see, it's really just a policy decision. There's no statutory reason for it. And no one would be asking for government-funded lawyers in this situation. So it's just providing the access and allowing somebody to go out and get their own lawyer to help them. So I think it's a good and important advocacy point. It's not just the children, it's anybody in the refugee processing system, but it's especially affecting children who are going through this on their own.
I have a comment and then I have a question. The comment is on Karen Barsado's question about that birth certificate, whether it's the children or adult, anybody who is fleeing out of the country and is seeking political asylum has no time to pick up birth certificate or passport or any document. So most of them, even if they have a birth certificate, they may not carry their birth certificate with them when they enter into another country seeking political asylum. Most of the cases, especially in the United States, I don't think that Immigration Department asks for the birth certificate under those kind of circumstances. So that's my comment. And my question actually is that since these children, they get a lot of protection, especially when they come to the United States, isn't it that at times parents also, they intentionally create that kind of environment so that at least their children, they get out of the country. Particularly I'm saying, I have seen in special immigrant juvenile status cases, and that applies to children asylum cases also, where parents, they are creating that kind of environment so that the children, they get out of the country and they get an opportunity to enter the United States. So are you aware of, are there those kind of cases where intentionally
So Karen's going to respond to your comment, but I don't think either of us, and maybe Kevin, you did, understood the question, the second part.
especially in case of children, like say a lot of young girls, they are forced to enter into prostitution, so that they become victims in their home country, and they flee their country and they enter into United States, so that without going through lengthy procedure of immigration here, on the basis of political asylum, they get adjusted here in the United States.
I mean,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
no, but I don't, are you
Yeah, that's
asking?
right.
Yeah. But no, I think I'm just a little confused, because I'm not clear if what you're asking is, could,
No,
let's say, having been a
I'm just asking
prostitute.
you that, isn't it that the liberal United States immigration policies at times indirectly creating that kind of environment in those countries?
I mean, I don't know if anybody else in the room wants to. I wouldn't say that U.S. asylum jurisprudence in any way. I've not, in any case that I've ever seen. Now, I'm not going to say this, but that results in a situation where somebody says, "I'm now going to traffic my child so she can get asylum." I've never heard of it. I've never seen it. Somebody might traffic their child because they're desperate, because XYZ, but not because their child's going to then get immigration status. I've never seen that.
They may not be actually trafficking, but they project as if the child is victim. Actually, child may not be victim, but
Well,
it's presented.
let me just respond to that. I mean, UNHCR did a survey of the kids, and at least 6 out of 10 had valid asylum claims. And they just issued a report today on women on the run, and they said that 58% of the women they interviewed had been sexually assaulted, and 100% had received no protection from the police, and that over 60% had valid asylum claims. So the idea that they're coming because they're going to get a permiso, I mean, the smugglers might use that to entice them, but the straw stirring the drink is the violence, is what's driving them. Because a lot of these moms are faced with, your kid's going to get on the bus and get killed the next day, or they're going to have to go, and that's a reality.
And I think if what you're asking is, are people lying, which might be, I don't know, that might have been part of your question, is, I mean, there certainly are people who lie, and there are ways to detect that in the asylum system, right? I mean, you have to be found to be credible. If you're found not to be credible, there's actually, it's pretty easy to sort of poke holes in credibility. So credibility is not a low standard. It's actually a high standard. So anyhow, there's the fraud checks and security checks, so also.
Right, and on your first question about how somebody proves their identity and nationality when they don't have time, in the exigencies of flight to get a copy of their birth certificate or whatever, it is true, and I'm going to flag Phyllis in the back of the room in case she has anything to add, but it is true that, in general, it's the obligation of an asylum seeker to prove their identity and nationality in the first instance, and that's best done by a birth certificate or a passport. It's also true that many asylum seekers, as you correctly point out, don't come for a variety of reasons with a copy of their birth certificate or a passport. Sometimes they never had one, sometimes they lost it on the way, sometimes it was robbed on the way, sometimes they didn't have control of it. So people can prove their identity and nationality by testimony, credible testimony, and that is often done by figuring out what language they speak, what they can tell you about the cities that they came from, what kind of food do you eat most of the time, what river is near your house, anything that they can do to kind of get a handle geographically. I've seen with adults, I've seen asylum officers ask them to sing the national anthem, or what are the top 3 products in your country, or one I had myself, somebody that they said their nationality, but the asylum officer had the idea they were from a different country. They asked them to draw the flag, and then they asked them which color were the stripes. And I thought, my goodness, if I had to draw the U.S. flag, I think I could figure it out if I looked at 2 or 3 different versions, but I couldn't off the top of my head tell you, where's the red and where's the white. I think if I could pick the wrong one if I was looking at them, but to just say it was very hard. But anyway, the point is, there are a variety of ways, and it's whatever comes out to credible testimony. It can have to do with the clothes they have on, travel documents they have, if there was an adult arrested with them, and where that person was coming from. With adults too, you can do it by affidavit. If you've got a 4-year-old child who's picked out of the river alone, that's a harder call to figure out what that child's nationality is. Phyllis, do you want to add anything about proof?
No, I think you've got it. You can rely on the secondary collateral evidence.
Thank you.
So David Martin had a question. Reese.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for Kevin, but it really builds on something that many of you mentioned, and I appreciate that a lot. You did refer to the funding initiative that the Obama administration had tried for getting money to be used in Central America to address many of those problems there. I mean, it's a long way from really solving the problem, even if it's enacted. But I didn't quite catch exactly what your assessment was, Kevin, of where that is. Second part is I appreciated many of you mentioned from different angles the real problems we have with the disarray of our asylum system. And to me, this is of great concern. Several of us worked 20 years ago in what looked like a very similar situation. The system was getting overwhelmed. It was not only keeping people with more meritorious claims from getting a grant so they could unify their families and access some other kinds of services, but it was also feeding on itself and raising some enforcement problems as people got to see that they thought of the asylum system as just a generator of work cards, and a lot of ill-founded claims came in. We're seeing that again. The numbers are going up a lot. And to me, so much of this came from just a neglect of funding, not a conscious decision. Congress and the executive branch are both to blame, especially the immigration judge corps. But right now we're so swamped, and there's so many other demands on asylum officers, and some of them are going to get pulled away probably to process any new increase in Syrian intake. So, one, you know, what's your sense, Kevin, of the likelihood of that $60 million getting approved? How many immigration judges does that provide for? And do you have a sense that there's any very widespread understanding in Congress and key executive branch people that this is really something that could blow up pretty badly on us before too long?
So the 60 million passed, I believe it was the Senate. It's still intact. It's 55 immigration judge teams, which I don't know if that's a lot, or it sounds like a significant number. But there is some concern on the Republican side that the money won't be used correctly, or they really don't want many of these kids and others to get before a judge. So there's still a risk that in the final negotiations that could be reduced some more. And then the money for attorneys for kids was zeroed out because there's been a line in the sand for years that we're not going to provide public money for lawyers for foreign-born individuals, and this would set a precedent that could open a floodgate. It could be a magnet for people to come. So I think that's, I mean, there was some language in the House bill about creating a pro bono network to help the kids, but there's no money behind it. So.
And the status of the Central America?
Oh, that I'll have to double check what the Senate did, but the House cut it by $400 million. And my understanding is a lot of that came out of the economic side and not the enforcement side, because of concerns of corruption, that the money's not going to go, and that we need to beef up their enforcement. So that's another issue where we need to do some work to help restore some of those cuts.
Can I make a comment, Michelle, one on the affirmative asylum backlog that David was just alluding to? When you go back to asylum reform, that exactly right, that was adopted to make it so that people were not just applying for asylum as a way to get a work permit. Then that got codified in the Act in '96, and the asylum office went to a last in, first out model, so that affirmative cases were supposed to be adjudicated within 60 days in the first instance and 180 days if they went to immigration court. And there was no work permit until the application had been pending for 180 days. But as the years have gone by, the waiting periods got to be so long that almost nobody in that affirmative process was getting an interview within the time, and everybody was getting a work permit. So then they decided as an operating policy, and there are now official memos in the asylum office that changed the procedure. So now they're on first in, first out with these, there's 3 priorities on top, cases that are rescheduled, unaccompanied children, and there's some other, someone help me out, whatever the third one is, I don't remember. There are 3 things that go first, and then after that, the oldest applications go first. So that's what I was saying before. They're admitting now, and they've started to post publicly on the website, the processing times, and tell you where they're working, but the predictions right now are that new affirmative applications for adults, not UACs, filed today are probably going to be 2 years on the adjudication. So it's really a concession that everybody filing a new case is going to get a work permit. So even under the current post-reform statutory scheme, we're having the exact same problem because of resources.
So I think that's the last comment. Thank you to the panel. And I also want to just thank everyone who organized. So Rachel, who's in the Reese. And Bishop Marzio, I just want to thank you all. This was a great day. And then Fried Frank, the staff, and Karen for hosting us. This was a wonderful